A couple of weeks after my parents were killed and my sister and I were shot, we were still in the hospital when I remember the doctors coming to me and saying, you need to get up and walk around and get your body working normally again. So I took off down this hallway with a stand with IV tubes coming off of it and walked down this long hallway to the very end where there was a big window. And I remember seeing cars driving up and down the main road and people walking out to their cars, and it just hitting me that, whether I was involved or not, life went on, and it was going to go on with or without me. And I remember getting a lot of advice during this time, that people telling me about this thing called closure that I frankly still don't know what it is. I had family telling me that I needed to move on and shake it off, and it was well-meaning. I think they just didn't want me to get stuck emotionally and psychologically in a bad place. I remember a woman, a couple of days after we were shot, I was in intensive care, waking up, and she was standing over me, and the first words out of her mouth were, "You need to be able to forgive those guys," which quite honestly was the dumbest thing anybody could say to me at the time. And I began to realize that they had no idea what I was going through. They did not know the first thing about how to address it. And most people don't, very few, unless you've been through it, know how to empathize and understand what somebody going through this victimization feels. And I learned another thing, and that is that emotionally, psychologically, and even physically, for a fairly long period of time, you are absolutely in shock. And you don't even realize it. I remember 4 months after I got out of the hospital, sitting one evening and feeling my abdominal muscles relax and release, and remembering in the house, just before my sister and I left the house that night, them tightening up and not even realizing it for that 4-month period of time that they were still completely locked up. And then about 2.5 years after that, I was a sophomore at Baylor University, and already at my 4th college, if you can believe that, when a former girlfriend from high school and one of her friends came to visit the university, and they were staying at my apartment. And I remember walking past an open window where they were having a conversation inside, and the friend saying to my former girlfriend, "Do you think you and Brooks will ever get back together?" And her response was, "I really doubt it, because there's just so much chaos in his life." And I remember it just continued walking along, feeling like somebody had literally kicked me in the stomach. And I was leaning over the trunk of my car and feeling this pain. And then it hitting me that for more than 2 years, I had not felt anything psychologically or emotionally. I just was not connected to anything that happened or anything that was said. And I was so happy to just feel something for the first time after that couple of years. And a couple of weeks later, I remember waking up one morning and feeling different and even a little bit rested, and realizing that I had slept several hours straight through the night before, and that in more than 2 years, I hadn't really slept more than a few minutes at a time. And I didn't even realize the things that were going on in my own body, in my own mind, and in my own emotions. I remember trying to describe it to somebody at the time, and I said, it's like standing and looking at trees outside, and it's overcast, and you see there's no leaves on the trees, but the branches are swinging back and forth, and I see people wearing coats. And so I realize it's cold and it's windy, but I can absolutely not feel the cold or the wind. And over time, as I began to feel more human, it was like backing away from that image enough to realize that I was actually looking through a window. And so I couldn't feel the cold and I couldn't feel the wind. And what I was actually feeling was the warmth of the heat from inside the house. And so there was, before that, just not a feeling of connection to anything that was really going on in my life. Another way that I described it was, and I think I actually had this dream one night, that I was trying to cross this river of thick mud that was chest deep. And sometimes it was one step forward, two steps back, but I was just fighting my way across this river. And every once in a while I would slip on a rock and slip further downstream. But, it was day to day just trying to take one more step to get to the other side of this river. And I equated, the steps as being positive decisions and positive actions. And every time though that I would make a bad decision or take an action, a negative type of action, I would slip a little further down the river. And so I was just trying the best I could to keep putting one foot in front of the other, hoping it would get me somewhere and hopefully closer to the other side. And there were a lot of things that I did. I remember during that time and the years that followed, I graduated from college and law school, became a lawyer, went into the military where I learned to do a lot of cool stuff. I even got elected to the state senate in Oklahoma, where I passed lots of legislation dealing with victims' rights and the criminal justice system. But it was like I was just running and trying to do anything that I could to keep from having to think about the things that had happened. And during that same time, Leslie and I had been going back and testifying 9 different times against these guys just to keep them behind bars. And I learned a couple of things about healing. And for victims, it's actually kind of a 2-track system for healing. And one of those is the more legal and institutional side of it. We grow up hearing that bad things don't happen to good people. And if they do, well, the police are there to protect us and to investigate and help us and to catch the person that did it. And then the courts are going to hold them accountable and they're going to punish them. And then we find out through this experience that that's not always the case. It doesn't always happen that way. And the system doesn't always embrace the victims or even try to help the victims. And so what happens is our belief and our faith in this criminal justice system and in these institutions completely collapses. And the only thing that's actually going to rebuild our faith in the system is to see the system work the way it's supposed to, that the right person is going to get caught, that they're going to be held accountable, they're going to be punished, and that we have a voice in the system and that the system will actually treat us fairly, and that we can go on with our lives afterwards and rebuild without having to constantly be looking over our shoulders to wondering if we're safe from harm or if we're going to have to go back and testify again and again and again, like Leslie and I did, pointlessly, and have our lives disrupted by all that. And so, a few years later, after I'd been in the Senate and dealing with this legal and institutional side of it is a legislative work. That's something that we address by passing legislation, by passing a U.S. constitutional amendment for crime victims, but it's dealing with it on a legal basis.